Hello. Good to see you, as always. Hope you have your Bibles ready, your book ready if need be. Hope you have already looked at the lesson. It's always the most ideal way to go about this, since we don't have time in this Bible study period to look at every single little thing that the lesson might cover. So it's the best way for us to get the most out of these lessons is to look at them throughout the week, and then we come here to review it and sort of get review is the best word I can think of. Today we're in Ezra chapter 6, and in the study of Ezra and Nehemiah. And if anybody has looked ahead to next week's lesson, or if you paid attention to the slides that I have showing what's coming up, you may have noticed that next week we will be in Nehemiah chapter 1. And this is where I'm going to throw out a pop quiz, okay? Does anybody know why we would go from Ezra chapter 6 to Nehemiah chapter 1? Because Ezra has 10 chapters. I'll stand here until somebody gives the correct answer. Anybody? Okay. They do overlap a little bit. There is some overlap. Remember how I said that just as the Jews were taken to Babylonia in 3 groups, they also came back in 3 groups. And I sort of have characterized or organized in a way to maybe help us understand that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra 1 through 6 is the first group under Zerubbabel. Then Nehemiah is the early stages of Nehemiah, covers the second group. He was the leader of the second group, and then Ezra was the leader of the third group, or at least the overlap is there. So Nehemiah and Ezra 7 through 10, what I'm trying to say, I may have messed that up, but what I'm trying to say is that Ezra 7 through 10, there's sort of a division between, or a mental division we should put, between Ezra 6 and 7, because the first 6 chapters covers that first group, and Ezra 7 through 10 covers a later period. So that's why I just sort of noticed that it may be confusing. Why are we going straight from Ezra 6 to Nehemiah chapter 1? When you're studying Ezra and Nehemiah, we would probably assume that we're going to be going through Ezra 7, 8, 9, 10, and then we'll start Nehemiah. But yes, the overlap is there, and Ezra 7 through 10 is sort of separate. So I try in my mind to think of Ezra 1 through 6 as Zerubbabel. So Ezra 1 through 6 is, if there was such a thing as the book of Zerubbabel, it would be Ezra 1 through 6. And that's why, like we've pointed out, Ezra hadn't even showed up in the book of Ezra yet, because the first 6 chapters cover that first return, that first group of people who returned. Okay, so much for the pop quiz that I didn't do any justice at all. So, when people are determined to complete a certain task, especially, hopefully, if it's a task that's given to them by God, they don't like to wait around. When we are determined to get something done, waiting around is painful. It is every minute or day that goes by feels like a year. Waiting around is not easy to do. Well, the Jews who returned to build the temple of God, to rebuild it, learned that lesson. If they didn't already know it, they were going to be reminded of it, because they initially worked with very much enthusiasm. They built the altar. They laid at least some portion of the foundation of the temple, but then they stopped because people were pressing them and opposing them and intimidating them. And then, as we saw last week, about 16 years passed before God finally sent Haggai and Zechariah two prophets to get them moving again, to rekindle their zeal and get it going, to finish the project, which they finally did. They finally got going. God was helping them. However, the people who didn't want them to do it for their own selfish reasons kept harassing them anyway. They didn't stop their opposition. So they were going to send a letter to the king to see if they should be doing this, if they had permission to do this. And while they awaited that letter, they continued working. Rather than maybe last time, stopping, this time they continued until they got word. Now, nothing in the text really tells exactly how long it took for the king to get the letter and to look into the matter and whatever else would have taken been a part of that process. The letter was going to have to be carried from Jerusalem to Babylon, 900 miles or so. So there's that. Then the response is going to have to do the same thing. So there were probably several months that passed before his answer arrived. But thankfully their resolve didn't diminish while they waited. Now that leads us to our text. More similar situations as we've seen in these first or most recent lessons in this study. Our chapter 6 picks up where chapter 5 left off. Surprise, surprise. That is not too shocking. After Darius the king had looked into the matter and seen that Cyrus, his predecessor, had in fact told them to do this. He had in fact given them the authority and the okay, the green light to finish this building, this house of their God, and including the details of the vessels, the silver and gold vessels from the temple and from the previous temple that Nebuchadnezzar had taken. He reinstated those, and they were basically, long story short, everything that the Jews said checked out. So chapter 6 begins like this. Then Darius the king made a decree, and search was made in Babylonia in the house of the archives where the documents were stored, and in Ecbatana, probably butchered that, but that's the best you're going to get from me, the citadel that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found on which this was written, a record. In the first year of Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices were offered, let its foundations be retained. Its height shall be 60 cubits and its breadth 60 cubits, with 3 layers of great stones and 1 layer of timber. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury, and so on and so forth. So we actually get additional information from this reciting of the letter than we actually got earlier in the book about sizes and things and small details, what we would consider small details. But as far as that place, the citadel, there were multiple different palaces or royal, I don't know what we would call it, estates in the country of Babylonia or Media, or whoever was in charge. They would go one in the summer. They'd have their summer house, basically, and then they'd have the one in the spring. They'd stay in one in the winter and things like that. So this was the summer residence, which is why it's mentioned there, why that place is mentioned. And that is the place where that decree was found, is really why it's mentioned. That's where they found it. So they recorded, the writer here records what that was, right down to the details of how high, what size it should be, specification of that it was to be, the foundations of it were to be retained, just as it was, as much as humanly possible as it was years ago. So he tells his officials this, and even tells them in verse 6, that he tells Tattenai, who's going to be a player here, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar, the other guy, and his associates, keep away. Let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, he says, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of the house of God. The cost is to be paid to these men in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province from beyond the river. Whatever is needed, bulls, rams, sheep for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, or oil, as the priests at Jerusalem require, let that be given to them day by day without fail, that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. That was probably a big part of it in his eyes. I don't believe in their God, but hey, if they're going to pray for the king and his sons, make these offerings, we better give them all the offerings they could possibly need to offer. I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled on it, and his house shall be made a dunghill. May the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put out a hand to alter this, or to destroy this house of God that is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree, let it be done with all diligence. So this was a big win. This was a big victory for the Jews. Thankfully, King Darius, he probably wasn't the greatest man, but he was, I don't know what adjective we might use. He had enough integrity, at least, or honesty maybe, to acknowledge that letter had been written, that decree had been given, and therefore it needs to be done. Also, can't forget the whole laws of Medes and Persians, that can't be revoked. So he sees that this was a decree that had been given, and so he says, let it be done. And he didn't change a thing. He said, here's some other things it says. It says it's to be paid from the royal treasury. Therefore, he tells the governor there and the others that were inquiring about this, you better make sure that it's paid in full from the royal revenue, the royal treasury. You also better make sure that whatever they need is given to them, animals and such, for these offerings and wheat and salt and wine and oil, whatever they require. You give it to them. You get it for them. Probably weren't too crazy about that, but we will see how that plays out. So, God is clearly behind all this. He told them to get busy. Now he's proved himself right. They said it's not a time to build the house of God, but what did I say? So once they started again, guess what? Everything worked out. They did what God said. Everything worked out as far as in the context of what God had specifically, explicitly told them to do by his command. So verse 13 then says, then according to the word sent by Darius the king, Tattenai the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar, Bozani, and their associates did with all diligence what Darius the king had ordered. And the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. They finished their building by decree of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes king of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. People of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. They set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their divisions for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. So, what do we see happening here? Well, it's finished, basically, or at least the record of it being finished is given. A few things stand out, though. One is the phrase, they built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai and Zechariah. What do you think it means that they built and prospered through the prophesying of two men?
I remember Haggai, God first, you say man, and of course, we all know, we all know it.
Yeah.
God through the man.
Yeah.
And he had say, look at yourselves, look at how you're doing. You are planting and you are not reaping. You are putting away and there's never anything left. Nothing is ever enough, nothing is ever enough.
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing that you think of, or that rather you don't think of, is the house of the Lord. Now, do the house of the Lord, and you will see how it will be with you.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like they saw how it was with them, and God, as He had promised, blessed them, and what they did, they were expecting results and never got them, and never getting them. Now they got the results they expected of them.
Exactly. Because they listened. They acknowledged the error of their ways, and they listened to the prophets, and not just acknowledged the error of their ways, but the need to change those ways. That's the key. Yes, I know that what we've been doing is wrong, but I'm human, so I'm going to keep doing them? No. We need to start doing it, doing what God said to do. And this but the phrase I'm specifically referring to here is through the prophesying of Haggai and Zechariah. So there's this dynamic of these men presented to them God, the word of God, a word from God, if you will, and they accepted it. They accepted it, seemingly without much question. So that's number one. Number two is clearly, I guess, an easier one. They finished it by decree of the God of Israel and Cyrus and the other kings. So they understood that this thing was decreed by God Himself. And that was the most important thing. As Haggai had to remind them, it seems, that God, yeah, He told you to do this, but He hadn't forgotten. He's still waiting. And He doesn't know why you're sitting around. So they listened. And then in verse 18, I guess verse 16, they dedicated it with joy. There's the joy of having realized that contrary to how it had been for the last 16 years, God proven right again. Consider your ways. And I guarantee you it'll be different. If your ways are different, then the consequences or the effects will be different. And that's not the only time God has done something like that. He did it in Malachi too, where He said, you know, I'm going to very loosely paraphrase, He basically dared them to try to outgive Him. And the implication is, you're going to lose every time. You'll lose. So stop being so greedy. Stop giving me the sick and the blind and the ones that you don't have any use for, and deceiving yourselves that I'm pleased with these things. You need to consider your ways. And on top of that, I dare you to try to give so much that you won't have even more. So it's a similar thing here, or before, I should say, where he told them, consider your ways, and it's kind of like, I dare you. Prove me wrong. Try to prove me wrong. And so they did it, and guess what? Proved Him right. Now they see not that they denied the truthfulness of God's word before, but they've seen it play out, experienced it play out, and especially how the reward that comes with putting more stock in your faith in God than your fear of people, your fear of men. And that wouldn't have been easy necessarily, but now they see the result of putting their faith in God despite the difficulties, practical difficulties around them. Then the other thing was the last phrase of verse 18. They set the priests in their divisions, the Levites in their divisions, for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. Well, somebody might say, well, what's the book of Moses? We don't have a book of Moses. Or do we? Well, yeah, we do. Got 5, to be honest. I mean, to be exact. Sometimes those 5 are joined together and referred to as the Pentateuch. But the point is, when it says the book of Moses, so Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Jesus acknowledged in a couple different places that Moses wrote, and then he would quote a passage from those things. So if he wrote 5 books, which one of them is the book of Moses? All 5 of them. So would it be incorrect to call Leviticus the book of Moses? In context? Yeah, it's part of what Moses wrote, but it is a book of, it is, in context, this is specifically referring to the rules and regulations of how the worship is to be set up. So the book where that's recorded, in this context, would be the book of Moses that he's referring to. The key is, as it is written. So they set it up as it is written, as God had decreed. We've already made this point in some of the other lessons, but anytime that is mentioned, it's worth pointing out again. The key, that God's people sought to do things in the way that God had authorized. Because there is a way that God had authorized, and there is still a way that God has authorized as opposed to any other way. Along those lines, the rest of the chapter talks about the Passover, how the Passover will be celebrated. And as we've pointed out in the past, or in the previous lessons, God later referred to the fact how they didn't really have the means to follow the law of Moses precisely during their captivity. They didn't have the freedom or the means to do that, and God, being the one that put them into captivity for their rebellion, understood that they didn't have the means or the freedom to do that, and he represented it as, I didn't require these things of you for those years. Well, now things have changed. So they didn't want to stop short of anything. Now they understand we have the ability, we have the freedom, we have the resources, we have the means. We need to also celebrate the Passover. So on the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. For the priests and the Levites had purified themselves together. All of them were clean. So they slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles and their fellow priests and for themselves. It was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by everyone who had joined them and separated himself from the uncleanness of the peoples of the land to worship Jehovah, the God of Israel. That's interesting, isn't it? Where did those people come from? Didn't hear about them. When did they do this? Doesn't really specify. Did it happen during the 70 years? Or did it happen during the past 16 years? It doesn't really specify, but it's still interesting to learn that there were some people, some non-Jews, who had recognized the Jews' religion and God, and who had joined them by separating themselves from their idols and the peoples of the lands. And they also partook of this Passover. So that's kind of encouraging and a lesson as well, that we don't usually see much of an evangelistic effort in Old Testament Judaism, in the in the Old Testament narrative. But that's not to say that God didn't expect them to be somewhat evangelistic the word we would probably use. They were certainly expected to be separate and influence people. Wouldn't God want more people worshiping him? So that's always going to be a good thing. We just don't see them doing it that much. And sadly, quite the opposite as time went on. It was far from that where they wouldn't even somebody who was seeking Jehovah and wanted to be a part, they had this sort of self-inflicted trap of, well, I can't deal with you, I can't associate with you because you're a Gentile and all this. So I mean, that's how do you convert somebody who is a Gentile when you say that you're not supposed to be associating with Gentiles? Kind of presents a brick wall. But here, somehow, by some means, at some point, there were some people of the land who had separated themselves from their own people to worship the one true God of Israel. Yes, sir.
I think that, I mean, this is probably, based on the history of it, I mean, this is the work of God to bring people to faith in him. Because if you look back, right, you've got Isaiah and prophesying Cyrus, and then Jeremiah and Darius, right? And it's almost, I would say it's almost certain that those kings knew of those prophecies. And I think that what you see is Cyrus's response to knowing that, it's quite possible that I was placed here, that I overcame the Assyrians by the power of this God.
Yeah.
And I don't know, to say it's the only God, I don't know. Maybe Cyrus is thinking that. But then he funds all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's almost a gospel response by Cyrus to God's grace in placing him to overcome Nebuchadnezzar. And this outpouring, and I think that that's where these folks come from, is from those kingdoms that have realized that the true God is the one of the Israelites, and they go and separate themselves from the uncleanness of the people to
Mm-hmm.
join and worship. And so it's interesting to see, how that was made open to them even at that time.
Yeah, it is. And the way it's worded, to me, suggests that they acknowledged such things as the uncleanness of the state they had been in. But that was so foreign to the way they would have naturally thought. It would have been, they may acknowledge that the God of the Israelites is powerful. So I'd kind of like to have him too. And that was probably how Cyrus thought of it, that we don't get any indication that Cyrus, rejected the idols, like you said. But these people did, So how did they come to the point where they realized that they needed to separate themselves, and that the peoples of the land were in uncleanness, and that Jehovah is a God that can be worshipped acceptably only when he's the only one? It seems to me that the answer to that is because somebody told them this. Somebody explained this to them. Otherwise, that wouldn't have been their natural inclination on how to become connected to the God of Israel. Somebody, it seems to me, maybe the prophets, informed them that was needed, and to their credit, they did that. Some of them may have been turned off by that. It's like, well, I'd kind of like to be connected to that God, but I'm not going to get rid of everything else. But however many people these were a part of this group did do that. So it's encouraging. Yeah, Dean? Yep. Yep, absolutely. And that would kind of lead to the assumption maybe that this took place over the last maybe even sooner than the last 16 years. Once they started resisting the opposition and going through with what they believed, and the more that prospered, the more people are going to notice that. And on the concept of God is working in all this. He's been working. I mean, everything that we read is God working for up to a purpose, to a specific purpose. And if you think about even in Egypt, you really technically the nation of Israel started. The Hebrews began in Egypt. It started with Abraham, but then Abraham's son Isaac, and then Jacob and Esau, or just Jacob rather, and then then Joseph and his brothers. That's kind of the stopping point as far as when they got to Egypt. But then over the next 400 years, they became a whole nation's worth of people. Well, couldn't God have brought about his purpose, which is ultimately the coming of the Christ, with them in Egypt? Well, we might think so, but God didn't think so. So he got them out of Egypt. Why did he get them out of Egypt? Well, there were multiple reasons, but the most obvious and emphasized reason is he's taking them to a land that will be their own. And what were they supposed to do in that land? Okay, to be his by driving out the people there. And so now they got their own place. So what do you think was accomplished? What might have been the purpose to remove them from Egypt, which was basically the Babylon of that time, into this new land that was just theirs? What's the difference? Okay, he promised to give them that. Why do you think he wanted them to have it? And wanted them to drive out the nations?
To set before the eyes of the world an example that no one will be able to find.
Okay.
That when they live the way he says to live, then that will truly be life, and everybody will be able to see.
Yeah, that would be certainly a very powerful example of their God's power and mercy and grace. From a strictly practical standpoint, the difference, the purpose and difference was they were separate. Like actually, especially if they had actually done what he said to the fullest, they were separate. So they weren't in the midst of this heathen people. They were removed from that, sort of plucked right out and placed in this land where they would be separate. Well, they started living as the nations. So God had to punish them. So he sent them to captivity. 70 years later, he's doing the exact same thing he did in Egypt. He's plucking them out of that heathen land from their punishment, bringing them back to the land where they would again, the goal would be to be separate. And it seems that going to the example point, they did have an example of that people noticed, people saw, and people somehow acknowledged. Well, I'm assuming that this had any connection with what they were doing at that present time, but maybe they just taught them about Jehovah in general, and they wanted to separate. Maybe they told them about their history. Maybe they had already heard something about their history. People talked back then. You didn't need the internet for word to spread. Okay, so remember Rahab said, "We've heard about you and your God, and we know what's going to happen here. So please show mercy on me and my house. Let me. I don't want to suffer the same fate as everybody else." Yes, sir.
Also, remember that king himself decreed that they was to do it, let them do it. So the king was behind them.
Yep.
He was supporting them. So, and like I said, we don't know, they don't have everything that was now known by the king yet, and I'm sure they knew the God of the children of Israel. They knew about him, because otherwise
Yeah, they, at some point, somehow they learned about the God of Israel, and they were attracted to the God of Israel. And that alone says something, I think, about it surely says something about God, but it seems to me it also says something about the people of God at that time. They were doing something right, in other words, for that to happen. So it says they kept the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days with joy. That's the Passover. For Jehovah had made them joyful and had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them, so that he aided them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. The king of Assyria is obviously referring to either Cyrus or Darius, probably Darius in this case, but he was the king of Persia. Well, the land that he was now over was not so long ago, in the big picture, Assyria. So, I mean, that may be confusing on the surface, but it's not really that. It's not an error or anything like that. That area was still probably considered by a lot of people Assyria. But anyway, how about this phrase? Jehovah made them joyful. Well, nothing too controversial about that. Has anybody ever made you joyful? Sure. Not anything special, miraculous. Just something they did made you joyful. That we already read that part above, how they celebrated it with joy because of what God had done for them. But the second part is even more powerful, that Jehovah turned the heart of the king to them so that he helped them. That was also part of their joy. So they celebrated it with joy because of everything that God had done for them, but also one of the specific things that they marveled at was how God turned even the heart of the king of the heathen superpower toward them to help them. Even the pagan king, God can turn the heart. First of all, God can turn the heart of somebody, even a man like the king of Assyria or the king of Persia. Without overtaking, he didn't, again, we already had a record of how that played out, at least generally, and then we speculated, if you remember in that first lesson, how, well, maybe somebody told Cyrus, maybe God told Cyrus himself, maybe, I'm talking about Cyrus in this case, maybe he was shown the prophecy specifically. Well, what about Darius? Did God reach in and literally control him to help? No. Providentially, he was working behind the scenes, if you will, to aid his people in the accomplishment of his will. And one of those things was that he turned the heart of the king of Assyria, or the king of Persia, however you want to put it. Yes, sir?
Throughout the history, we see where God did change the heart of evil men. Now, how did he do it? I don't know why he did it. But even if children of Israel, he changed the heart of some of them, just like Saul, that he did to Noah. God changed the heart. The events once they had, we know that even today, God can change the hearts of different individuals. Just like when Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, we know that for some reason the Roman army held back and allowed all the Jews. Now, why would they have? They were in control of everything. Why did they all of a sudden stop?
Yeah.
It was a battle that Jesus, that God was in control of, where the children of Israel didn't have to do a thing. God did all of it for them.
God can do amazing things. And I'll emphasize again that he doesn't need to do some kind of in-your-face miracle like raising somebody from the dead in front of you to do amazing things. He can do amazing things without anybody ever even knowing that he's doing it. Through his providence, he's working. The both Old and New Testament confirm pretty heavily that God is more or less always, he's always at work in one way or another, and mostly in ways that we cannot detect in a physical, tangible way. But we can trust and have faith that he is doing it because he has said that he is doing it. Okay, applications. First one, just as the Jews sought to order temple worship according to the book of Moses, we must seek to worship God worship in the manner prescribed by God. We should not be tempted to create some style of worship that is simply to please men. Man is not the one being worshiped. The foremost thing about worship is, does it please God? Because if we're presuming to worship God, we need to make sure that our worship is going to be pleasing to God. If it's not pleasing to God, it's not worship God. It's not worship to God. If it's not approved by God, it's not worship to God. And it's not glorifying to God if it's not according to the way that he has specified, where he has specified. And we can see that in the New Testament as well, where God's people worshiped him in a certain way, and obviously there's a reason for that. So our worship is glorifying to God only when it is authorized by God and thus pleasing to him. So just because I mean it from all the depths of my heart doesn't mean God is pleased with it, and the Old Testament is filled with examples of that truth. That even though it may be sincere doesn't mean that it is glorifying to God. It's not glorifying to God just because I say, God, this is for you. Or God, this is to your glory. Am I doing as God has instructed? That is the key. If God says, this glorifies me, then that would mean that doesn't glorify me. And finally, the emphasis placed on observing the Passover after the completion of the temple reminds us of the importance of remembering what God has done. That was, at least for them, it was more looking forward in a way to what it was. It was looking backward, but also there was some prophetic element in the Passover too. But for them, it was a look at what God has done for us already, because the Passover was instituted at the end of the plagues and commemorating to a degree his deliverance of them from Egypt. For us, we worship. And an element of our worship is also remembering what God has done for us. And really, it shouldn't just be our worship, but every day of our lives should be commemorating what God has done for us. And they provide an excellent example of that here. They wanted to do it, and they wanted to do it right. Dean, do you have something else? Yep. They viewed it as a privilege, the opportunity, but a privilege, not an obligation. It was an obligation, but they didn't view it as an obligation. They viewed it as a privilege. I want to do this, and we are thankful that we have the privilege, and we're thankful for what it commemorates, especially.